Welcome to Life Passages, the Soul's Journey. I'm glad you're with us. The title of our show today is When God Spoke to Me. And I'm your host, Nancy Bloom. And our guest, DavidPaul Doyle, has compiled and gathered together the stories of many people, many of them very ordinary seeming people, who've had experiences with God. And you were just saying, DavidPaul, and welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you were just saying that in your experience, people are longing for this connection with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, I mean, of the hundreds and even thousands of people my wife have worked with over the years and traveling around, I just find that everyone, regardless of their background, regardless of their religion, regardless of their beliefs, they're longing for some kind of a connection, a fullness, a wholeness, that peace, fulfillment, just something within them that speaks to them and that makes them feel good and happy and fulfilled. And they call it different words, but I think it's all the same thing.
And what's your sense of what it is? Maybe it's hard to put
in
words.
I think it's God.
You think
but
it's God?
You could use source, you could use, your true self, that universal presence that we all share.
Yes.
So the words are many, but I think that what it is the same.
Beautiful. Yeah, and so as I was alluding to, you felt called apparently to pull together these stories of various people that have had profound experiences with that presence, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, my wife, my passion is helping people to hear God's voice within, and I'm always looking for ways and in methods to reach people, to help people get inspired to want to hear that voice, and then to make it easier for them to do it. And just in working with so many people over the years, I'd hear so many fascinating stories from ordinary people. And I thought, people love to read stories. They love to see that other people just like them can have these experiences, whether it's wealth building or empowerment or finding your soulmate, and in this case, hearing God's voice. And so I just started gathering stories from people from all walks of life, backgrounds, religions, beliefs, situations that had these life-changing experiences of connecting with God and having that change their life in an instant.
Wow.
And so I started gathering them together and wanted to get them out there.
And what were your life passages? The title of our show is Life Passages, so I'm always curious about the life passages of each guest. What were your life passages that led you to this passion to awaken people to their own way of hearing God's voice or the voice of the Holy Spirit?
Well, about 20 years ago, my wife started hearing that voice within her in a really clear and recognizable way, and we were struggling in our marriage, and I was struggling personally, and we started asking this voice to help us, to guide us and teach us. And over the years, it really transformed our lives. And eventually, I said, I want to hear that voice for myself. And I started asking that voice, how can I do that? And over the course of a couple of years, we were given some very simple, practical steps. And I followed them, and it worked. And I started hearing that voice in a real conversational way. And I think it really transformed my life so much. Gave me all these incredible healing tools, both emotionally, mentally, physically, and things that I could really apply practically in my life. So I just wanted to give that gift to other people because it was really, I think, the most precious gift I had ever received.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And the two of you co-created a book earlier, and we did an interview on that.
Yeah.
The Voice for Love, you entitled it. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your journey to this book. And I wanted to ask you a few questions then about this. So as you came to know not only your own experience, but then began to gather other people's experiences together, what are the most common ways that you notice that people hear God's voice?
Yeah. I think people are hearing God's voice all the time, and they just don't call it that. They call it maybe many other things, or they just think God just came to me. But in talking to so many people over the years, I think that emotionally, people are receiving communication all the time through their emotions, whether it's joy and passion and comfort and peace. And they don't necessarily call it God's voice, but in talking to people, I just find that they're receiving that very frequently. I think in our thinking is another way. We'll have a stream of thoughts come through our mind, or just even an inspirational thought. And when you really start probing those people, describe to you what really happened and what shifted and what was the result, it's really all the same, you know?
Yes.
I think another way is through one another. You know, there's so many people sharing this divine voice in so many ways that we can read it in books, we can read it in newspapers and TV shows and movies, and you know, just even casually at the grocery store, someone says something to you that's very inspired. And I think we're all sharing that voice a lot, more than we even aware of, and also hearing that voice through all of us all the time. And we just don't call it God's voice, but it may still have the same impact of learning to see things differently, of reconnecting us with peace and joy and love and oneness. So I think, and then obviously there's the common way, or maybe the one people think of the most, of going within to that quiet place, whether you access it in nature or meditation. So I think those 4 ways I've seen are probably the most common ways.
You know, what you're saying is reminding me that long, long ago, 1970, my boyfriend was someone who had just come out of Vietnam and was very, very troubled. And at one point he was in crisis. We were up at some distant land in nature, and he went into this huge crisis, and I didn't know how to help him. I didn't know what to say, and I was just there. And then suddenly words came through, and they were just the right words. And not only the words, they were a feeling. And hearing that and feeling the feeling that was coming through me, I wasn't creating it. I could have never thought of that. He just calmed. It was just the balm, B-A-L-M, that he needed for his soul at that time. So,
exactly,
yeah.
And that happens a lot, all the time. You know, even at meeting a stranger on the street. So it happens.
Yes, and what a grace it is.
Yeah.
Yes. And then it can be good for people to understand a little better, I think. How can you tell if you're hearing God's voice or not?
Yeah.
I mean, how can you tell if what you heard came from God?
I think that's one of the most common questions people ask. How do I know if this is from God or not? And, you know, from my own personal experience and all the students we've taught and all the people I've spoken with, there's this common experience of love. You know, even the religions talk about, you know, that God is love, source is love. And when people have a direct experience of spirit, it's always this love-based. And all the stories in the book have a component of love. And I think that if what we're hearing is filled with love, or a quality or aspect of love, I like to call them flavors of love, whether it's peace, joy, wholeness, connection, comfort, something that makes you feel connected and with yourself or with another, you know, they're all coming from love. They're all coming from God. And if what we're hearing makes us feel afraid, separate, alone, hurt, angry, sad, judgmental, you know, somehow separates us from ourselves, one another, and God, then we can know that that's not coming from God's voice. You know, some people might call that the voice of fear or the voice of ego. There's lots of different words to describe that way of thinking, but really, it all comes down to love or fear. You know, are you hearing a quality of love or an aspect of love, or are you hearing a quality or aspect of fear? And it's really that simple. The litmus test is simple. You know, does it make you feel closer and connected with love, or does it take you away from it?
Well said. Wow. And so then why do people find it difficult to receive clear and recognizable communication and guidance from God?
You know, I think a lot of us are conditioned to think of hearing God's voice. We pigeonhole it as this big, loud voice. You know, it's like that way in movies or, you know, even the Bible and common experiences. People talk about, I heard this loud voice. And I think we start to pigeonhole you know, how God can speak to us. So people are oftentimes listening for a voice. And if they don't hear a voice or some loud message that seems to come from outside of them, they don't think it's God. And I think so just that idea alone keeps us from hearing God's voice, because the truth is God is part of us. It's not an outside voice. It's a voice that comes deep from within. And so I think that's one thing that keeps us from hearing that voice. I also think that we seek that voice frequently when we're in desperation. You know, deep fear, deep hurt, deep anger, deep hopelessness. And when we're mired in all that emotion and we're identified with it, it's really, really hard to hear that voice because we're feeling so much separation in that moment. Ironically, a lot of the stories in the book, what happens is when people get so deep into that separation, they eventually hit bottom. And you know, whether it's alcoholism, drugs, poverty, divorce, whatever, oftentimes people have the greatest spiritual epiphanies or healings when they hit bottom because they've exhausted all other means. And they've surrendered and let go to that attachment because it's not working. You know, they've reached such a low that there's nowhere else to go.
Sort of like, just can't manufacture any thoughts or feelings or movement at all.
You know, we're so attached to that pain, we're so identified, and we finally let it go, and we open up to something greater. And I think that's a very common way that people hear God's voice, is to hit bottom, unfortunately. But we did include stories in the book where people, you know, are more conscientiously going within and getting communication. And obviously that's what we teach, because we don't want everyone to have to go hit bottom to heal themselves or to
hear God's voice, which is available to all of us, it so seems. And then what steps can people take right now to hear God's voice more clearly in their lives?
I think the most important thing is to be present with what is. You know, when we're in denial, when we're pushing things down, if we're feeling fear, we're feeling hurt or anger or confusion, just to be with that experience, to sit there and get, what are we experiencing right now? That's the first step. Because if we're not in the present moment, it's really hard to hear that voice. And then once we are connecting with what our actual experience is, we can open up to not judge it, not push it away, not try to control it, but to have a loving relationship with what's going on in our experience. I find that that's a common thread of people opening up, is how can you relate to your experience in a loving way?
Ah, lovely.
And then, on top of that, to ask. People forget to ask. They always think, well, aren't I just going to get something? You know? But it's like, when we ask, we're making a conscious decision to receive an answer. And it kind of opens us up.
That's lovely.
Yeah, so I think...
Ask and you shall receive.
Exactly. It's really true. You know, because God is not judging us. God isn't saying, oh, you need fixing. Oh, I better go help you. Oh, you're in trouble. I'm going to help you. God sees our perfection, our wholeness. God sees that we remain as He created us to be. And that there is, in truth, nothing to fix or solve because we haven't left our wholeness. We haven't left our core essence. And that is who we really are. Because God sees us in that way, there's really nothing to fix or solve. We're the ones that believe in our separation. We're the ones that believe that we've made mistakes, that we're wrong, that we've been hurt, because we don't experience that grand divinity that we are.
And we have believed it. Maybe we want to believe something else.
So, but if we ask for help, we get it.
Yes.
You know, it's a really important piece. People have to ask to receive.
Ask and you shall receive. Good. And of the hundreds of people you've interviewed over the years about their experience of hearing God's voice, what are the primary things that you've found in common between all of them?
You know, we just touched upon it, but it's really, I think the number one thing is desire. If every single person, of the hundreds of stories I received for the book, of all the people I've spoken to, there was a moment of wanting to hear that voice, which is really tied to asking. That
longing again.
Yeah, like you have to want it. If you don't want it, why is God going to give you something that you don't want?
Or you might not be listening to anyway.
That's true. That's true. Or maybe you've asked for it unconsciously. But you know, when you sincerely desire to hear that voice, it opens up the possibility that you will. And if we don't ask, we won't receive. So just that the desire to do so is number one. I also found this thread of these three things: surrender, not knowing, and willingness.
And say more about those.
Well, when I looked at all the stories, I really analyzed people's experiences, and I came to see that in the moment of hearing God's voice, there was a willingness, there was a surrender to something greater, something larger than their experience. And there was also a willingness to not know what the truth was. They became open to not their perspective, that their perspectives were maybe limited or not serving them, or somehow, there was something greater than that truth. And just by that willingness, surrender, not knowing, they opened up to hearing that voice.
Profound. Yeah. Makes me think of the man who wrote Amazing Grace. It's a long story, but a very wretched, depraved person who in a moment of opening received the song and a total life change.
Beautiful.
So we are going to talk about some of the most dramatic stories in your collection, but do you want to speak first about, you have a DVD, it's something new that you've brought together.
Thank you.
To help us hear God's voice. And why don't you let us know about that?
I'm really excited about this because...
And maybe we'll have the camera people pan into this.
My wife and I have been teaching this 5-step process for the past 7 years. And it just works. We teach it in our workshops. We teach it in everything that we do. There's 5 steps that we've been given from God's voice, from the Holy Spirit, that gives people a really simple, direct way to hear that voice for themselves in a very conversational way. And we've taught it to literally tens of thousands of people over the years, but we've never had it in video format. So I'm really excited about this because we have 9 hours of high-definition video, and we're putting this out into a lot of different formats. It'll be in Blu-ray, it'll be in DVD, an audio format, and also an iPhone app.
Wow.
And eventually an Android
so
app.
Just on your iPhone, you can be hearing ways of connecting with God.
Or watching the actual video on your iPhone or your iPad. So we want to get this out there in as many different ways as possible so that people can, be listening to it or watching it anywhere, anytime.
Great.
So we're really excited about it, and I think it's the most complete, the most full teaching we've ever offered in a product before, instead of a 2-day workshop or something. And I'm so thrilled it's getting out there in video.
Wonderful.
And what's neat, too, is it's going to have subtitles.
Oh.
And so the subtitles are going to start to be translated as well so that people can actually read in different languages what we're saying. So
someone in Japan could get it and read it in Japanese.
Exactly. Yeah.
And again, the title is 5 Steps. What is it called?
5 Steps to Hearing God's Voice.
To Hearing God's Voice.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah.
So, let's go on and have you share maybe 3 of the most dramatic stories about hearing God's voice. We have probably about 8 or 9 minutes, something like that.
This is such a hard question because I wouldn't accept any story in this book that didn't just, really touch my heart. If it didn't really grab me and make me just, practically, I cried for so many of these stories. And if it didn't do that, it didn't get in the book. So for me to choose 1 or 2 specifics is tough. But, one that comes into my mind right now was this story by this gentleman. His name was Ken. And Ken had some mental challenges. He had gone in and out of psychiatric hospitals. He was really, in a tough place. And he felt so disconnected. In one field trip that the hospital took to this church one day. And Ken was like, God, I can't hear your voice. I feel so lost. Please give me some reassurance.
God, he was calling to God.
He was calling out to God. He says, I can't hear you. I'm too messed up. But please, there's these other people in the church. I see this group of people over there. Please send me one of them to say that you hear me at least and to let me know that you're with me. And he sat there and he was praying and he was crying and he was praying, and slowly everyone started leaving. And he thought that everyone had left and just started bawling that God didn't hear him. And finally this woman came over. He didn't know this woman. And she knelt down by him and touched him and said, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I just feel like I have to come over here because God's telling me to tell you that he loves you and he's with you.
Oh.
And they both just started bawling, and she didn't know him. She didn't know why. She said she fought it. She said she heard this message 3 times. She's like, I can't do that. I don't know that person. And again, there's just so many stories in this book that are so powerful. And I just get choked up even saying the story.
Yeah, I got that.
You know? So it's...
Wow.
Yeah.
And may we listen when a voice comes for someone else like that.
Exactly.
Sometimes we have to step over protocols or,
Yeah.
to deliver it. And would you like to share another or two with us?
Get me emotional. You know,
which is a good thing.
I put one of my favorite stories first. I can't help it. You know, I had to order the stories. It was from a mother whose daughter fell ill. She had been ill, having challenges. She fell ill and stopped breathing and kind of fell to the ground. And she had run out of her daughter's medicine. And she had to call the doctor, and the doctor called it in, but there was only 15 minutes left before the pharmacy was going to close, and she's racing down the highway. And this woman was not religious, didn't necessarily, wasn't raised religious, didn't practice anything, and she's just sobbing and crying to God in the car on the way there. And the way she describes it, the mucus is coming down her face, and she's just distraught because if she doesn't get this medicine to her daughter's probably going to die. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she just hears this loud, booming voice. And God says, will you give her to me? And she's like, how can you ask me that question right now? What are you saying? And God just says, will you give her to me?
Give the daughter to him.
Yeah. And she's just crying, and she said, fine, I give her to you, okay. I can't believe this, but I'll do it. And he goes, thank you, my precious servant. And she's like, what do you mean? I've never been into you in my whole life. And she goes to the pharmacy, and it's closed. And she doesn't get the medicine. And she comes back, and her mom was watching her daughter, and she's trudging up the stairs. And all of a sudden, her daughter bursts through the door and says, Mommy, Mommy. She's like, what happened? She asked her mom. She's like, I don't know, but she was lying there, not breathing, and about 20 minutes ago, she just all of a sudden got up out of the blue and said, I'm thirsty. And, it was just an incredible story.
That's probably my favorite.
Yeah.
And I shared it with someone yesterday, one of my clients, and she started crying. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah, all of these stories are just really powerful.
Maybe we have 2 or 3 minutes. You want to do one more?
I like this story. Another story just popped in my head.
Okay, whichever you want to share.
This one story was this man who was a young teenager, rebellious, kind of into drugs and alcohol, a runaway, and he was drunk one day and went out on this railroad tracks and got hit by a train. And he remembers very clearly hovering over his body in the hospital while the doctors worked on him. And he saw this bright light, and he started walking to the light. He left the body, and he said he just felt so soothed and so loved, and he just felt so comfortable, and he had never felt that way in his life because he was so troubled teen. And he heard this voice say, it's not time for you. You need to go back. And he's like, no, I don't want to go back. And they said, it's not time for you. You need to go back. And the next thing he remembers was that he woke up like 2 months later. He had been in like a coma, and his body was all broken up, broken legs, broken arms, everything was really broken. But he said he woke up a different man. He woke up with this memory of this experience and this something. He just knew he had this calling to find that love again in his life.
The love he'd experienced over there.
Yeah, and although he never fully recovered mentally in the sense that he had challenges, he just had challenges for the rest of his life. But
because of the accident.
But he never lost that calling. And the man he turned out to be over his lifetime, he's an old man now, he's 60, 70 years old, but that he plays instruments, and he is a part of the Polar Bear Club, and he really lives life fully, and he has so much love to give, and he works with children, and who he became was different. I find that actually happened to me when I was younger, a deep, profound experience of love that showed me what was possible. And I think that happens to a lot of the people in the story. It's not that their lives change, but they're given a gift of the tremendous love, the unconditional love that is really there for all of us, that motivates us. It shows us where we're going to, what we should be striving towards to have in our life. And that really happened for him.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it becomes who we are, I think.
Exactly. It becomes
and then it leads us to what we're to do.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing those stories. Each one is very, very inspiring. And this last one, to me, it seems to say that when we have this experience, maybe not just of a heard voice, but of a sense of unity with that God presence, even for a short time like he did in this near-death seeming experience, maybe it changes us, not just our soul, but our body, our energy, everything.
Everything.
We become new in a very profound way.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think that's the theme in all of these stories, that although I gave you examples of hearing a voice, there's so many different ways. There's 33 different ways that God speaks to people in this book. And yet they all had the same outcome.
Yes.
They all had an experience of peace, of transformation, of seeing things differently, of hope, of their problems, their pain falling away. So it doesn't actually matter how we hear that voice, but when we connect with it in all the different ways, that's when the miracle happens. The healing happens. So,
what a gift to bring forth this collection and this new DVD that is the 5 steps of hearing God's voice. You're doing such a beautiful work, and I see that it's God's presence within you and that love that came to you early on that now wants to be lived through you and to be brought forth in these ways for other people. So I'm very grateful that you're doing this work. I'm grateful you came on the show. And thank you for watching Life Passages. Open to God's presence, God's voice within you and for you. See what happens. And join us on Life Passages again, Monday evenings, 9:30 p.m., Channel 15. We bring forth things that can serve your soul's journey through life. Be well. Take care.
God is in the mountains, God is in the trees, God is in the oceans, God is in the seas, God is in the wind, God is in the breeze, God is in you, God is in me. God is in the rivers, God is in the streams, God is in your visions, God is in your dreams. Spirit is everything, no matter how it seems. So follow your visions and live